Weird Space, written by A.M. Wiley, narrated by the author. Cover design and illustration by Daniel Wiley. Music composed by Caitlin Anselmo. Copyright 2023. Prologue, 1992, in another dimension. The Zoltarian dimension was the last to fall. It contained a small and beautiful galaxy. The planets were so close the Zoltarians connected them by encased bridges. Wanderers once camped along these star roads as they hiked to the different planets. Their dimension gateway was in the sky over Zoltar's capital planet, where the people had been peaceful, productive members of the Interdimensional Council. But the star roads that once glowed with the lanterns of travelers were now dark appendages connecting planets with no light. Star vessels, great and small, drifted lifelessly through the close galaxy. The Dimension Warriors had marked Zoltar lost. All 9 dimensions had fallen. The large Zoltarian portal flashed blue and spat out what looked like a firefly. It zipped erratically, trailing a twinkling tail of sparks. It nearly collided with one of the star roads before banking sharply. To see it closer, the firefly was a wide, rectangular 8-passenger ship. An A-29 cruiser, to be exact. The bronze-plated spacecraft was like an aged memorial or something ancient, a worn symbol of the North Star, stretched to look like a sword, and encircled by 9 smaller stars, was emblazoned on the starboard side. Its cockpit, which currently stood empty, was a half-dome of windows. This was a family vessel, perfect for interdimensional travel. Modified above and below with ball turrets containing stolen Gremlin gutter guns, and reinforced armored plating at the bow and stern. Of its modified twin-engine thrusters, one rocket worked, while the other choked glowing particles from the damaged intake. Then the gateway yawned as a giant beast broke through the portal. Bulbous like a misshapen planet, its wrinkled purple-black skin was vivisected with rockets, gun turrets and tiny windows, launch bays and thick plates of armor. The cyborg Leviathan blinked with lights and bore mechanical insectoid legs, part creature, part warship. Its eyes gleamed red as it chased its prey. This was Lord Malgore's necrobeast. The cruiser lurched wildly as its thrusters flared. Its captain and only occupant was a girl of 12 wearing an oversized flight jacket, panic-soaked with sweat. Tossed about as the ship pitched and screamed with alarms. A fire sprang out from a bank of monitors by her head, and she quickly sprayed it with a foam extinguisher. She kicked a panel and the alarms died. She was about to move for the cockpit when she noticed the frayed ends of her wild black hair were on fire. She sprayed the flaming tips with foam and shook the smoke from her head. The fire's out, she punched a flickering radar screen. The fizzling display showed her ship's dot. The warship's large circle filled the screen and was closing the distance. An automated voice warned of an incoming. The girl climbed up into the ceiling ball turret and saw the necrobeast had fired a green undulating orb, now speeding toward her. She gasped, dropped into the cabin, and lunged into the cockpit. The orb struck the right stern, the ship convulsed, and an alarm shrieked as sparks showered her mop of tangled raven hair. The cabin lights flickered and went out. The alarm died. She was in total darkness, but for the stars outside and the growing red light of the oncoming ship. She heard no sound but her own short breaths. Taking the pilot's seat, she yanked on a headset and kicked the dash controls. The dying ship flickered back to life. "Please work, please! Bash, are you there?" In another dimension, the Tauran dimension, in the deep tunnel systems of the Tauran planet, a group of children between the ages of 10 and 15 huddled in a smooth, brown-walled cave with a low ceiling. The bunker was dimly lit with lanterns. Blinking gear and monitors lay shoved against the walls. The kids, tattered and dusty, each hefting an adult-sized rifle. They huddled around a small screen, watching as the girl's face fizzled in and out. A girl working the signal yelled, "We've got her, Bash!" A 14-year-old boy with bright blue eyes and the cruiser pilot's same messy black hair shoved through the crowd. He grabbed the screen close to his face as the others gathered. He wore the same black fighter jacket, the North Star symbol patch on his shoulder. "Sheela, you made it!" "I got it, Bash." Sheela dug into her jacket and removed a small blue glowing object. Bash and the others leaned in, wide-eyed. "The key was exactly where I knew Father would hide it." Malgore caught the others. The key will lead me to whatever dimension Father hid the polar starship. Bash nodded soberly. Where are you? The cruiser jolted Sheela from her seat. The necrobeast's spider arms had caught hold of her ship. Wait, is Malgore chasing you now? I can't talk right now, I'm going. Going where? Bash said. Sheela held out the key and ran her thumb over the blue lights so that one glowing dot projected a hologram of coordinates. She read them aloud. 10th dimension? There's no 10th dimension. Sheela, come here first. We'll go together. She shook her head as the warship's shadow closed over her. That would lead Malgore to you. That starship is all that can save any of us. She touched her screen. I'll find the ship and come for you. For Orel. He put one fist to his heart. They all did. For Orel. Sheela entered the coordinates into the navigation system and aimed the ship at the Zoltarian gateway. The spider arms were sinking laser tips into the cruiser's body, pulling it into a fleshy red and black umbilical cord from below the necrobeast. Sheela shoved away tears. Stay alive! That's an order! She killed the feed and threw all her weight forward on the thrusters, routing all auxiliary power to the rockets. Outside, the tiny cruiser ripped from the arms of the beast and shot back through the gateway. Chapter 1. 10th Dimension, Uncharted. Drew Shipley always found it impossible not to stare at the stars, and this summer evening was no different. The dusk was hazy from the sweltering day. The smell of hot tar rose off the cooling asphalt, mixing with the symphony of crickets and the rhythmic hiss of automatic sprinklers. As he pedaled his Huffy hard along Sweepstakes Avenue, the breeze kicked back his shaggy blonde hair. He yanked a walkie off his belt and brought it to his mouth. Mickey Mouse has warts. Over. He wobbled, trying to steer the bike with one hand. I'm approaching Uptown. Justin, Kevin, do you copy? Over. He could see the lights from Warfield just ahead. The town was so small it barely showed up on any map. If you were lost in a song on the radio, you'd drive right through it and never know. Drew pumped his bony legs hard against the pedals. He only lived a mile outside of town, but he'd taken the long way to avoid the graveyard. Tonight he was lost in the gigantic night sky with its peach-pink horizon and deep dome of stars. He looked up again and a moment later ran headlong into a pair of trash cans. Every dog within earshot barked and several porch lights flicked on. Drew hurriedly propped up the cans, tossed in some loose trash, and shoved off. He cut through the woods, racing across a thin footpath as the briars tugged at his pant legs and honeysuckles brushed his face. He emerged beside the hardware store and jumped off the curb onto the crowded main street, swerving from the streetlights and pretending they were UFOs trying to beam him up. He fantasized more on summer nights, imagining the town residents were spies and femme fatales or aliens mimicking humans. The pasty old men in their lawn chairs outside Pete's barbershop shouted for him to get a haircut. They were aliens for sure. Drew waved but kept pedaling. Have a good night, he called over his shoulder. His walkie squawked. Drew, come in. It's Justin. Over. As Drew tried to respond, he veered into a row of bikes propped on their kickstands. He skidded to a stop and watched the domino effect as the bikes crashed to the pavement. When he went to pick them up, he had a horrifying realization. These belonged to the big boys. The big boys were the closest thing Warfield had to a gang, and he was already on their hit list. He looked around and saw Jimmy Griffin and his cronies in the arcade across the street. Drew sped away through the crowd of witnesses, praying no one had gotten a good look at his face. We're stationed at the Druid, over, Justin called over the walkie. On my way! Drew pedaled a few blocks and found the two boys exiting the movie theater. The heavy one was being escorted by a young male usher. The little skinny one held the walkie. You're banned this month, Kevin, the usher huffed. You don't mean that, Bruce. Kevin Godoy was an enormous pale boy with blonde, greasy hair. He insisted on wearing one of 4 Hawaiian shirts, none of which fit him. What buttons hadn't popped off were always straining over his massive midsection. Drew flew to a stop as the usher stormed back into the lobby. Kevin started performing a stand-up routine during the movie again, Justin said. Justin McGrath was black and a fidgety wisp of a boy with large glasses. Like Kevin, Justin always wore the same thing, only his wardrobe was mostly all NASA windbreakers he got from space camp every summer. It made him look like an astronaut. Your pops told us you were still grounded, Kevin said. Don't worry about it. Drew was looking back down Main Street to see the big boys leaving the arcade. They'd just seen their bikes. Let's go get Ryan, Drew said. Drew and his friends rode out of town, weaving through the crowd as people jumped out of their way. They passed the old used bookstore and Jack and Ray's restaurant. After that were a few sparse neighborhoods and then nothing but cornfields and tangled, sprawling woods. They came to the baseball field, a quarter-mile west of town, and parked their bikes against the backstop. Ryan Wilcox stood at the mound, staring down the giant batter at home plate. Ryan's Huskies were up 5-0 at the bottom of the ninth, and there was no way they'd be losing. Drew waved to catch Ryan's attention. Ryan glanced at him, and Drew pointed at his watch, hoping his best friend would speed it up. Drew mouthed the secret code. "Mickey Mouse has warts." Ryan looked away from him and readied himself for the pitch, while Drew, Justin, and Kevin began making stupid faces. Ryan ignored them and pitched a laser. Strike one. When his friends blinked flashlights at him, messaging crude words in Morse code, Ryan responded with a beautiful curveball. Strike two. He smirked, knowing he was about to win their little game. Then Kevin lifted his Hawaiian shirt and pressed his pale belly against the backstop, his flab bulging through the chain-link diamonds like rising buns in the oven. Ryan choked out a laugh but tried to refocus and shook his head. The catcher was confused, thinking the sudden headshake were a signal. "Ryan, what are you doing?" His dad, Big Jake, the Warfield sports legend, yelled from the dugout. Ryan stifled his laugh and hurled a pitch so hard the catcher fell back into the umpire. Ryan's team ran out onto the field to celebrate on the mound. This was his first no-hitter. Drew couldn't help feeling weird as he watched his lifelong best friend hoot and holler with his team. He'd been waiting to see when Ryan would finally figure out he was too cool for the likes of Drew Shipley. On their way through the parking lot, Big Jake high-fived his son. "It reminded me of my first no-hitter. Jimmy Cone, ice cream on me." The team cheered, but Ryan waved them on. "You guys have fun. Where are you going?" But Ryan was already jogging up to Drew and the gang. "Can I have your autograph?" Kevin grabbed him like an adoring fan, while Justin took the game ball and turned it over in his hand. "What was the airspeed velocity of that ball?" Justin asked. Drew approached. "You can go get ice cream if you want. And let you guys have all the fun?" Ryan held out his hand, and they commenced with an elaborate secret handshake, ending with rooster crows. "Hey, I thought you were grounded." Drew shrugged. "Come on." They all jumped on their bikes and rode back through town, toward Drew's neighborhood. They turned into Angela Court, an incongruent cul-de-sac of faded bungalows, Cape Cods, and ranch houses. The court backed right up to a wavy ocean of corn belonging to the Gladhill farm. Drew lived in a yellow split level. His parents had moved in after his grandpa passed away. A garden and a fresh green lawn used to be out front, but weeds now strangled the garden, and crabgrass had overtaken the lawn. Gravel crunched under their tires as they rode up Drew's driveway. They wheeled around the side yard, where the quiet backyard was lit only by the glow of a TV pouring through the kitchen window. They ditched their bikes against the house, and Drew hushed them with a finger to his lips. Then he dug into his backpack and began handing out flashlights. He whispered, "Boundaries are the same as last time. Cornfield to Pal's Run, western woods to the creek, and no further than the Gladhill barn." Drew smacked his flickering flashlight to rejigger the batteries inside. "I don't like the cornfield. I'm allergic to the pesticides," Justin said. "I brought tissues." Drew checked his watch and looked back at the TV through the window. "I'm not going near the barn. It's haunted. Robbie Barrows disappeared in there," Kevin protested. "I made that up, Kevin," Drew said. "Besides, it was just one kid." Drew had secretly feared the Gladhill barn since he was little. He'd seen its slanted cupola and rusted tin roof from his bedroom window all his life. The abandoned farmhouse was torn down 20 years before he was born, but the field between his neighborhood and the barn was leased out for corn. Drew once heard his parents discuss the mystery around who even owned the property. "I'm supposed to be home by now," Justin said, looking close at his digital watch. "We're all supposed to be home," Ryan nudged Drew. "Guys," Drew said, "it's a perfect night. Why go home when we could be out here, together?" They all agreed and headed across the yard toward the cornfield. "What are you guys doing?" The voice startled them, and Justin shrieked. They'd been caught. Chapter 2. Ghost in the Graveyard. It was a standoff. Drew's next-door neighbor, Kristen Miller, and her friends, Sonetta Brock and Missy Allen, had returned from the pool. They were leaning over her privacy fence, and Kristen was smiling wickedly. Drew had known Kristen all his life. They'd been playmates throughout childhood, but now she was a girl. A real girl. "Why do you always wear that stupid hat, Ryan?" Kristen asked, her green eyes flashing in the distant streetlights. It's part of my uniform." Ryan spun his hat from back to front and pulled the bill low. Justin was hiding behind Kevin. "Yeah, well, you're not in the game now." The other two girls snickered. Kristen's skin was bronzed from weeks at the pool. She'd been the first sixth grader to attempt makeup, and her once soft features had receded to reveal the beginnings of a woman. Her mere presence terrified most boys her age. Sonetta stood a foot shorter than the other two, her ebony skin smooth and shiny. Her puffy hair was wrapped with blue hair knockers. Her giant pink towel was wrapped tightly around her, and whenever she talked to Drew and his friends, she wore a disapproving scowl. Missy's fair skin was burned, and her wild lion's mane of strawberry blonde hair was sun-streaked. She always grimaced like she'd just licked a lemon, and she shouted, squeaked, or squealed nearly everything she said. Drew tried to hurry his friends along. Seeing the girls made him feel hot, excited, and freaked out all at once. Girls, particularly these, made them clam up and act stupid, so it was better to retreat. "It's almost bedtime," Sonetta called out. "Where are you boys going?" "I heard somebody was grounded. Again," Kristen said, smiling at Drew. "Tell us where you're going, or we're going to tell Drew's dad," Missy said. "No, please!" Justin came swishing around from behind Kevin. His eyes were large and scared through his thick glasses. "We'll do anything. Don't tell." The boys looked at Drew helplessly. "All right, fine. You just can't give away any of our secrets." Kristen smirked. "Secrets? You're such a bunch of dorks." They followed Drew through the corn. The group of them squeezed between the regimented corn stalks, jumping and shrieking, tagging and scaring each other. Their flashlights danced like mad fireflies up through the leaves. Drew paused several times to look up at the galaxies overhead and only came back to Earth when Missy grabbed his wrist and slapped him with his own hand. "Stop hitting yourself." He looked skyward again, rubbing the sore spot on his cheek. Kevin bumped into him from behind. "Hey, Space Cadet, keep it moving." He couldn't see the barn, but he knew right where it was, the broadside looming on the far side of the cornfield. "We'll start in the woods," Drew said. He didn't want to get any closer to the barn. None of them did. He cut sharply to the right and led them into the tree line. They followed a narrow footpath beaten down by generations of kids who'd owned the woods before them. Those kids had disappeared into adulthood. Drew had once liked the idea of following in the old footsteps, but now their names etched into the trees made him think of ghosts. Drew looked back at them, a group he'd known all his life. They were all changing too, and soon they'd be ghosts if they weren't careful. "Hey!" Drew called out. They all gathered around him as he yanked out a strand of his hair and held it out. "We'll never grow up. Swear on the hair." No one remembered the origin of the hair, or why they swore on it. Drew promised he hadn't started it. He claimed that adults swore on the Bible, but kids swore this way. The truth was his mom, Anne, had started it. He'd simply forgotten. "May we never grow up and become sad and work all the time and die. And if we break this oath, may we grow old and die." "I swear," the rest repeated. Kristen rolled her eyes. Even as they swore, he could feel them slipping away. They were all growing up and were going to leave him. Then he'd be alone. They came to the edge of the woods and could just make out the barn. The large, dilapidated structure was terrifying during the day, but at night, when it blended with the twisted locusts and vines, it looked like a black hole. "Can we please go?" Missy squealed. "A kid got killed out here." "Shut up, Missy," Sonetta said, her eyes wide. "Kids disappeared in there," Drew said. "Never seen again." "I'm positive we're trespassing," Justin said. Kristen said, "Ryan, you're big and strong. Why don't you go in?" She glanced sideways at the lanky boy as he shifted nervously. Drew said, "We're playing Ghost in the Graveyard. One person hides in the field and tries to catch everyone else as we get across." "We haven't forgotten how to play," Kristen said. "Not it," Missy said. Everyone touched their noses except Ryan. He'd been too distracted looking at Kristen. "Fine," Ryan grunted and jogged into the corn. Drew hustled to the far end of the field near the barn. Ryan got to the middle of the field and counted down out loud. When he finished, Drew took off through the corn. He knew Ryan would be nowhere near him, so he took his time. He tried not to look to his right, tried not to think about the barn. He paused. Someone was near him. Then came a whisper. "Hey, Drew." His blood rushed cold. He froze. Before he could switch on his light, he was punched so hard the air evaporated from his lungs and his flashlight flew into the leaves. "Good to see you, friend," Jimmy Griffin said as Drew gasped for air. Jimmy and the big boys crowded around him. "We could hear Missy for miles. Heard you knocked over our bikes and didn't bother to pick 'em up." Jimmy spun Drew around and shoved him to the ground. Then he took Drew's arm and twisted it back. Drew groaned. "You guys having fun?" Jimmy asked. He spoke gently, even kindly. Drew gritted his teeth, the pain escaping in grunts and tight breaths. He could hear his friends. Ryan had caught them all, and now they were all searching for him. In the other direction. Jimmy was twisting his arm in an unnatural motion, and Drew hissed in agony. "My bike's all scratched up. Can't let you off easy this time," Jimmy said. The others chuckled. Drew pulled away, but they overpowered him and dragged him out of the corn to the Gladhill barn. The dilapidated homestead barn loomed over them. Jimmy punched him in the gut, and they all shoved Drew against the barn doors. He hit the warped planks and fell to the ground. Billy, the number 2, threw Drew's flashlight at him. It hit him in the head and fell beside him. "We're gonna leave you for the ghosts," Jimmy said, and they melted back into the corn. Drew tried to get up, but was still catching his breath. The humiliation was worse than the pain, but it all gave way to terror when he remembered where he was. "They're just stories," he repeated to himself as he went to get up. Suddenly, he felt the hairs on his arms and neck stand up. A tingling sensation crawled up his back. His flashlight, laying nearby in some milkweed, flickered on and shone back on the barn. Drew stared dumbly as the flashlight grew brighter and brighter, buzzing until the bulb blew out with a tiny pop. Drew lay planted in the silence when his walkie crackled to life and a girl's voice blasted in and out.
"Bash, anyone, help me! I'm going down, I'm going down!"
Drew crawled to his walkie and snatched it. "Kristen?"
"Who is this? Help me, I'm crashing in an uncharted dimension."
The signal cut out. His friends were all talking and laughing their way back toward the neighborhood. This wasn't them. He'd picked up someone else's signal. He pressed the talk button and lifted it to his mouth. "Are you in trouble? Do you need the police?" The girl's voice returned, quivering.
"Help me, please. I'm going down, help!"
She cut off and Drew lay frozen in the leaves, clinging to the walkie. Then he heard a low rumble and looked slowly to the sky. The stars. Something wasn't right. One of them winked brighter than the others and looked like it was spiraling. It grew closer and closer, growing bright blue as it fell to earth. Then it crashed in the tall evergreens behind the barn, and a murder of crows erupted into the sky. An earthreal blue light haloed the barn, and a low humming sounded before it went dark and quiet again. Drew had forgotten to breathe. After a moment, he raised the walkie to his mouth and whispered, "Hello?" Silence, but for the birds. But then...
"Drew?"
Ryan's voice startled him over the walkie. Drew was quivering. "Ryan, I'm at the barn. You're not going to believe this."
"Dude, your dad's here."
His dad fumbled with the walkie.
"Home. Now, son."
But Drew couldn't move. He lay there staring at where he'd seen the star fall. He could see nothing now. No sign, no light, and no screaming girl. Drew lay there so long, Ryan finally appeared, leading his dad to him. They were calling for him, but he didn't hear them. He was having a moment. One of those where you wonder if you're insane. For Drew, this meant thinking the daydreaming had finally gotten the better of him. He was now talking to alien girls and seeing UFOs. Had Jimmy given him a concussion? His dad, Steve, dismissed Ryan. Steve's tired frame was rigid as he tramped toward his son. Steve was taken aback to see Drew sitting on the ground. Drew hadn't moved or broken his gaze from the barn, pondering in dread what was behind it. Even as Steve murmured about Drew being responsible and not living with his head in the clouds, Drew just lay there, mouth agape. "Get up!" Steve hoisted him up. Drew tried to speak, but he couldn't. He weakly motioned at the barn, but he couldn't form words. "This is not what your mother would want." Steve was about to launch into one of his lectures, but he deflated and wearily trudged home. Drew followed. Flashlight tag would be over for a while, but at that moment, it didn't matter. Drew was afraid he could no longer distinguish between reality and fantasy. That night, as he lay wide awake and very much grounded for the rest of the summer, his mind kept going over the event. He had the walkie beside his bed, and he whispered into it throughout the night. "Hello? Are you out there?" But there was no answer, and there was only one way to prove he wasn't crazy. Chapter 3. Close Encounters. "Do not leave the house." Steve hurriedly made himself breakfast and was spinning in circles, looking for his briefcase. "It's by the recliner," Drew said absently. He sat at the table in front of an untouched bowl of Cheerios, glued to the morning news on their small kitchen TV, its retractable rabbit ears pointed up like a crooked peace sign. But the signal was always snowy. A heat advisory was in effect, and the carnival would be opening soon. Nothing about a plane crash, a comet, a UFO, abductions, anything. He skimmed his dad's newspaper again. Nothing. Steve had been storming about the kitchen, muttering to himself. He left the room and came back with the briefcase, wrestling with his blazer. "I'll be home late today, but Mrs. Miller said she's around if you need anything. She also knows you're grounded. Again. I'll be calling regularly. Clean up your room, do the dishes, and do the laundry." Steve checked his watch and started out of the kitchen. He stopped and stood in the doorway, hesitating. "Son?" Drew pulled himself away from the news with a start. I just want to say, I need you to grow up." "Okay, Dad." Steve left and Drew heard the door close. He turned to watch through the window as his dad's Chevette drove up the street, and then he bolted to his room. He grabbed his walkie and talked into it as he packed his backpack with M80s, big fat firecrackers that could blow your hand right off if you weren't careful, and some ninja throwing stars. "Come in, Ryan, over." A moment later, Ryan's voice came over Drew's walkie, his voice low.
Hey, what happened to you last night?
"Ryan, shut up a second. This is important. I saw a light, and it crashed behind the barn."
Drew, you just got grounded for the rest of your life. What is the matter with you?
"I know you think I'm making this up, but I'm not."
If you're leaving your house, count me out. And don't tell me if you're going, because I will turn you in. Over and out.
Ryan switched off to the soft sound of static. Drew switched off and peered out his window. The barn stood on the horizon, haunting and mocking him. The day was hot, hazy, and normal. No aliens or creatures, or helicopters. He could have dreamed it. "What do you say, Drew? Stay home, watch a movie, and stay out of trouble?" He shoved his walkie into his backpack and grabbed a cola and some chips. Lastly, he grabbed his dad's pump-action BB gun. He shook it and heard the BBs rattling in the chamber. He went out the back and stayed low, creeping along Kristen's privacy fence. The girls were out in the backyard playing badminton. Drew ran and launched into the cornstalks before they spotted him. To keep from being seen by whatever had crashed, Drew's plan was to take the path through the woods and approach the barn from the west. He paused to pump the BB gun to its maximum threshold, and then moved cautiously up a row of corn. The long leaves slapped and gripped at him. He cradled the gun against his shoulder, aiming the barrel low, the way they did in the movies. He imagined himself on a search and destroy mission in the steamy jungles of Vietnam. "Don't get distracted," he whispered to himself. Something was out here. Something real. He sprinted from the field into the trees. The moist, warm air was close in the woods, and the Maryland humidity hung heavily on Drew's sweat-drenched body. He moved slowly along the footpath, looking for any signs, large tracks, glowing green goo dripping from branches, little green people. Crossing over the creek, he pushed through the vines and low branches. The forest felt foreign, and it occurred to Drew what might have happened to all those kids who once played in these woods. They hadn't grown up and left. Creatures from outer space had snatched them. Drew resisted the fear and pressed forward. He could just see the barn now, its tin roof rising like the bow of a ghost ship. Drew knelt and listened, checking his surroundings. A strange tension lingered in the air, the hint of something beyond taste, sound, or touch. The sensation was electric, tingling through him and making him buoyant. He could sense it. Something was out here. He couldn't hear a sound, and the dappled sunlight and shifting shadows below the dense canopy made it difficult to see what might be lurking just ahead as he pushed through the brambles and low branches. A horsefly suddenly darted at him and sent him running headlong into a newly spun spiderweb. Drew whirled around, slapped his neck, and jumped, dropping his gun in the leaves. He yanked the wad of silky web off his face and wiped it in the dirt. No spider. It was probably in his shirt. He realized then that he was standing in the clearing in front of the barn. The barn where Robbie Barrows had disappeared. and where even Jimmy Griffin and his big boys wouldn't go. It somehow looked worse in the daytime. He switched on his walkie, and it babbled snow. He pressed the talk button, his voice barely a whisper. "Hello? Anyone out there?" He waited longer than was necessary. Once he was around that barn, he'd see it, and the world would never be the same. He licked his lips, but his tongue was dry. One small leap for Drew Shipley, one giant leap for all kid kind. Drew unshouldered his gun and moved slowly to the corner. He paused, gave it a 3 count, looked into his destiny, and found nothing. Birds chirped and the sky was blue. He spied no smoldering tree stumps, no smoking wreckage, and no government agents chasing a squat, waddling alien. Nothing. Behind the barn, the ground sloped steeply away into a wall of thick evergreens. He climbed up on a lip of the barn's concrete foundation for a better view. All looked normal. He climbed higher on the ledge and went on his toes. Now he could see the area behind the trees. There was nothing there. These were still just the woods, and he was still just a daydreamer. "Dang," he whispered.
"Dang,"
a tiny frog voice repeated. Drew turned slowly to his left. The thing he saw stood upright on the ledge next to him, the size of a rat. It had short-cropped white fur, big brown eyes, and drooping ears. Its tiny pink nose sniffed the air, and it waved at him with one of its 3 webbed paws.
"Dang,"
it squeaked again. Drew screamed. The thing screamed, and its fur flashed from white to bright orange. Drew backpedaled onto a loose piece of concrete. It gave way and tumbled down the slope. The world flipped, with the sun below him and the hill above, a jarring spin cycle of sunlight, grass, sky, barn, and mud. He hit his head, his backpack crunched, and his BB gun was driven into his hip. He somersaulted into the evergreens and took out some low branches as he glided over a blanket of dead pine needles. Sliding to a stop, he lay there face down beneath a pile of pine cones. The sweet smell of sap filled his nostrils as he groaned. He pushed himself up and froze. Drew lay at the mouth of a trench with exploded wood chips blanketing the ground like confetti. This was not what he'd seen from the ledge. Metal crates were stacked in piles, and a small satellite dish stood erect and opened upward, beeping. His eyes followed to the end of the trench, where an unidentified crashed object rested in the soft earth. It didn't have wings, but 3 rocket boosters yawned back at him. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't anything he'd ever seen before. It was the length of a large camper. The long hexagonal body was galvanized, and dark copper-colored armor plating. He got to his feet. His dad's BB gun had cracked in the middle, and now hung limp off his shoulder. Drew couldn't take his eyes away, and a moan escaped his slack-jawed mouth. He smacked his face and ran both muddy hands through his hair. No matter how hard he pinched and hit himself, the ship was still there. "What?" he whisper-chuckled. He then looked from the sky to the ship at the trees and all around, mumbling as if his friends were standing there with him. "It's still there. It's a spaceship." He inched cautiously toward it and saw black, blistering scorch marks blooming all over the exterior and a half-dome of windows at the front, but he couldn't get to the windows with the way the ship was pressed into the pines. He reached out with a shaking hand and touched it. The surface was cool and vibrated, popping goosebumps on his arms. He laughed, and his vision blurred through welling tears. He ran his hand along it as he passed back around the rockets. On the other side, he paused. A gull-wing hatch sat open, and a short staircase was lowered to just off the ground. A thin vapor of mist cascaded from the opening. Drew screamed as another furry monkey creature turned orange and shrieked.
"Mayday, going down!"
It waddled beneath the ship, scampered up one rear leg to the undercarriage, and disappeared into the landing gear. Drew cradled his broken BB gun as BB spilled from the busted chamber. He flipped the barrel around, held it up like a club, and moved toward the hatch. When he got to it, he couldn't see inside. It was too dark. He gulped and forced himself forward. He took one step at a time and passed through the hatch. The darkness paralyzed him. He soaked in the alien vessel with all his senses. It was cool inside. He heard a low hum, followed by scampering and rustling. More of those creatures rushed about. His eyes adjusted to the natural light from the cabin windows up front. The rest of the ship was cave dark. Dim lights and blinking monitors came into view like stars. The interior smelled of burnt circuitry and leather, as well as the metal and other things he didn't yet know about. He crouched in a corridor with a low ceiling. Orange conduit ran along the walls between blinking panels. Wiring hung from the ceiling, the frayed ends sparking and snapping. It reminded him of Kevin's mom's conversion van. The low hum gave him the sense that this thing was hibernating, very much alive. What if it suddenly took off? Tightly knotted rigging restrained gear and gadgetry along the walls. He crept slowly through the fuselage, pausing to gaze at the gun rack of copper-colored rectangular guns with short stocks, their barrels lined with blue glowing dots. Beside the guns hung helmets, chest guards, visors, and shin and elbow pads. They were painted and marked and tied off with beads, string, and wiring. Still crouching, he walked a narrow track between bucket seats, screens, and consoles with blinking buttons, levers, and switches, all coming into focus through the warm glow of yellow running lights. It was a sweltering dream, and he was intoxicated. He entered the front cabin and looked up through the half-dome of windows. The sunlight spilled in over the pilot's seat. A flight wheel with a disintegrating leather grip cover and a dash of what he assumed were flight controls. Drew couldn't help it. He laughed and danced and gasped to himself as he clapped his hands and shook his head. Then he sat carefully in the large seat. Its brown broken leather crunched and creaked beneath him. He sat for a moment, his eyes washing over the dash before he allowed himself to reach out and grab the wheel. He turned it and then pressed a few buttons on the busy control panel. Nothing happened. But he was awestruck, and tears ran down his cheeks as he laughed out loud. He felt that tingle of magic, as if he'd just discovered dinosaurs still existed. He couldn't yet articulate it, but his heart was full and his mind clear. The world was no longer dark, and his life had changed forever. Then he heard a hum behind him. Someone was there. His full heart froze, and he felt a warm release of pee. Before he could turn around, a blast from behind struck and hurled him headfirst into the flight wheel.